The bank called me twice in 1 hour, and the second call was the one that broke something in me. The first was a small decline, a candle order I never placed. The second was $9,000, spent in a single afternoon, on a celebration I didn't even know existed. A celebration for my own sister. A celebration I was never told about, in a family that had somehow decided I only mattered when there was a bill to cover. Stay with me until the end of this one because there's a detail that surfaces almost an hour in that reframes everything you think you understand about this family. And if stories like this one pull at something in you, hit subscribe, drop a like, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. My name is Priya Kessler. I'm 29, and for most of my life, I measured my place in my family by how much I could give it. I grew up outside Portland, the older of two daughters, in a house where money was always a little tighter than anyone admitted out loud. My father, Nathaniel, ran a small hardware store that survived more on stubbornness than profit. My mother, Colette, worked the front desk at a dental office, answering phones for a paycheck that never stretched quite far enough. I remember being maybe 11 years old, watching my mother separate bills into piles on the kitchen table and deciding, without anyone telling me to, that whatever I became, I would become the kind of person who made that table a little less tense. So that's what I did. I studied hard, took the first job that paid steadily, and worked my way into logistics management over 6 years of long hours and careful decisions. I paid off my parents' roof, repair the year the estimate came in twice as high as expected. I covered my mother's dental surgery when her own insurance, ironically, came up short. I sent money quietly without announcements, because in my mind, that's what love looked like when you didn't have the luxury of easy affection to offer instead. I still remembered the exact year that pattern locked into place. I was 17, and I'd taken a part-time job stocking shelves at a grocery store 2 towns over, mostly so I could stop asking my parents for gas money. When my first paycheck cleared, I didn't spend a cent of it on myself. I handed half of it to my mother without her asking because the look of relief on her face felt, at the time, like the closest thing to being told I was doing something right. I didn't realize yet that I was teaching my family exactly how to see me, not as a daughter who needed care, but as a dependable source of it. My younger sister, Ren, never had to build that kind of usefulness because she never needed to. She was 3 years younger and effortlessly likable in every room she walked into, the kind of person who could show up late and still be the one everyone was glad to see. When she struggled, our parents softened immediately. When I struggled, I was reminded that I was the strong one, the capable one, the one who didn't need the same softness. I used to tell myself this was simply the natural order of families. Older children get responsibility, younger children get warmth. I believed that story for a long time, mostly because believing anything else meant admitting a truth I wasn't ready to sit with. Ren's 30th birthday was approaching that spring, and in past years, my mother would have already called me by then, asking about restaurant availability, debating guest counts, wanting my opinion on flowers even if she never really took it. This year, the calls stopped early, and I didn't notice at first because absence doesn't announce itself. It just quietly becomes the new normal. When I did call, my mother sounded distracted, told me she'd call back, and never did. My father's replies shrank to single words. Ren, who usually texted me constantly about nothing in particular, went almost silent for 2 full weeks. I told myself everyone was simply busy. I had no solid reason yet to believe otherwise, only a small, cold feeling settling low in my chest, the kind you get when a room goes quiet the moment you walk into it, and you can't explain why, only that you feel it. Looking back, there were smaller signs even before that, ones I dismissed as easily as I dismissed everything else that didn't fit the story I wanted to believe about my own family. My mother had asked, almost casually, whether I had any upcoming work travel planned for the following month. I told her no, and she seemed oddly relieved, though at the time I read it as simple interest rather than scheduling around my absence. My father had asked to borrow my laptop one evening to look something up, and when I handed it over, he took it into the other room instead of using it at the table like he normally would have. I didn't think anything of it. I had spent so many years assuming good faith by default that I'd never built the instinct to question it, even when the evidence was sitting in plain sight. At a family dinner about 3 weeks before the birthday, I noticed something I brushed off far too easily. My mother and Ren kept exchanging glances across the table, small ones, the kind meant to be invisible. At one point, my phone buzzed with a work notification, and I set it down on the counter while helping clear plates. When I picked it back up 10 minutes later, it had been moved slightly, angled differently than I remembered leaving it. I told myself I was imagining things. I wanted to believe that because the alternative required a kind of suspicion I didn't want to feel toward my own family. Three days before Ren's birthday, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off a package that had been delivered there by mistake, an old habit, since I'd used their address for a few subscriptions I hadn't gotten around to updating. My mother's car wasn't in the driveway. I still had my old key, so I let myself in to leave the package on the kitchen table, planning to be in and out in under 2 minutes. That's when I saw the folder sitting open beside my mother's laptop. It was thick, a floral arrangement invoice, a catering contract, a rental agreement for string lights and a photo backdrop, a deposit slip for a rooftop venue downtown. The total at the bottom of the summary page stopped my breath in my chest, $11,400. And beside that number, in my mother's handwriting, for words I will never be able to unsee. Priya won't even notice. I stood in my parents' kitchen, holding a folder with my own name written into it like a punchline, and for a moment I genuinely couldn't move. My hands started shaking before my mind had caught up to why. I flipped through the pages with numb fingers, and near the bottom of the rental agreement, partially printed for verification, was a card number. The last 4 digits matched mine exactly. I sat down at that kitchen table for a long time. Somewhere out there, an entire 30th birthday celebration was quietly being built on my credit line, and no one had thought to tell me it existed, let alone ask whether I was willing to fund it, or whether I'd even be welcome to attend. I wanted an explanation that didn't hurt. Maybe, I told myself, they intended to pay me back as a surprise gesture, some strange logic I hadn't considered yet. I clung to that thought because the alternative was unbearable. That evening, I called my mother and asked, carefully, whether Ren's birthday plans were finalized. There was a pause a beat too long before she answered. "We didn't want to stress you with the planning," she said. "You already do so much for this family. We wanted this one to be easy on everyone." I asked if I was invited. The silence stretched 3 full seconds before she said the venue was small this year. Intimate, close friends only, as though she expected me to simply understand that my own exclusion made perfect sense once she framed it that way. I asked if my card was somehow involved in any of it. She hesitated again, then said something vague about sorting logistics later, and quickly changed the subject to ask whether I'd heard back from a job reference she needed for someone at her office. I hung up before my voice could betray how close I was to breaking. I mentioned the folder to exactly one person before the party, my coworker, Delia, who I'd grabbed coffee with the morning after I found it. I told her about the invoice, the handwriting, the card number, and watched her expression shift from polite concern to genuine alarm. "You need to call the bank tonight, not wait for something to happen," she told me. "Don't wait until you're standing in the middle of it." I nodded along, but some quiet, stubborn part of me still wanted to believe there was a version of that night where I was wrong about all of it, where I'd walk in on a surprise gathering meant for me too, and laugh at myself for jumping to conclusions. I didn't call the bank that night. I told myself I would wait and see. I didn't yet understand how much that single decision to wait would end up costing me, or how quickly the waiting would be taken out of my hands entirely. The night of the party, I didn't drive past the venue. I didn't check anyone's social media. I went to work instead, because work was still one place where being useful felt like something I'd chosen, not something quietly taken from me. I stayed late finishing a shipment audit, and by 8 p.m. the office had emptied out around me, leaving just the hum of the overhead lights and the sound of my own keyboard. My phone rang at 8:52. The caller ID read Fraud Prevention, Meridian Bank. I almost let it go to voicemail. I answered instead, and a calm, practiced voice asked whether I was currently authorizing several large transactions on my card. I told her no, my card was in my wallet, sitting closed beside my laptop, exactly where it always was. She asked me to confirm the last 4 digits. They matched. Then she read the charges back to me, one at a time. A floral wholesaler, an event rental company, a private catering service, a photography studio, and, finally, a deposit to a rooftop venue downtown. Combined with earlier charges made across the past several weeks, the total had just crossed $9,000. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. She explained the newest charges had triggered an automatic fraud flag because of how large and closely clustered they were, exactly the pattern the system was designed to catch. She froze the card on the spot and told me a formal case would open within 24 hours. Before hanging up, she asked one more question, almost in passing. Do you know anyone who might have had access to your card information recently? I didn't answer right away because I already knew. And somewhere across the city, at that exact moment, a rooftop lined with string lights and rented centerpieces was about to have its final vendor payment quietly rejected, and no one there yet understood why. The first call after that came just under 15 minutes later. It wasn't Ren. It was the caterer, apparently handed my number by my mother as the emergency billing contact, asking, tightly, whether I could authorize the remaining balance because the card on file had just been declined mid-service. I told him, as steadily as I could manage, that the card had been frozen due to unauthorized use, and that I had no way to lift that freeze even if I wanted to. He went quiet, then said something that told me the scene behind him was already unraveling, that guests were starting to notice the delay, and staff were asking him what to do about the food still waiting to be served. 2 minutes after that, Ren called, her voice already sharp with panic before I said a word. The caterer says your card got declined, she said. What did you do? I told her, plainly, that I hadn't done anything, that my own bank had frozen my own card after flagging thousands of dollars in charges I never approved. There was a pause on her end, the specific kind of pause that told me she already understood exactly what that meant and was choosing in that moment to pretend she didn't. You're doing this on purpose, she said. You're ruining my night because you weren't invited and you're jealous. That sentence landed harder than the theft itself, because it meant she already knew I hadn't been invited, and her only real concern was that the truth was now inconveniencing her celebration. She hung up before I could respond. My father called 2 minutes later, his voice low and clipped, the tone he used when he wanted to sound composed but wasn't quite managing it. He said the venue manager was asking questions in front of guests, and it was embarrassing, and could I please just call the bank back and authorize the remaining balance so the evening could continue without a scene. I asked him one question. Just one. Had he known my card was being used before tonight? He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said something that told me everything anyway. We were going to explain it eventually, he said. You always help. We didn't think it would be a big deal. As if my consent had never been a variable worth weighing in the first place. As if, in their minds, I existed primarily as a resource to allocate when convenient, and to notify afterward, if at all. I put my phone on silent and sat alone in the dark office, staring at the window, replaying every year I'd spent believing effort would eventually earn me a seat at that table. It hadn't. It had only earned me a larger bill. I later pieced together the timeline of that night almost minute by minute, partly from the investigator's notes and partly from a cousin who'd been there and reached out afterward, feeling guilty for having said nothing at the time. Around 8:15, the string lights had just been switched on for the evening portion of the party, and the photographer was setting up for a series of formal portraits with Ren and her closest friends. The first card decline came through at the register where guests were settling a bar tab, small enough that the bartender assumed it was a simple technical glitch and quietly ran it again. It was the second decline, on the catering balance 20 minutes later, that caused the venue's event coordinator to pull my father aside and ask, in front of several guests standing close enough to overhear, whether there was a backup payment method on file. The party, I later learned, spiraled fast once the final payment failed. With deposits reversed and the balance unpaid, the catering staff stopped plating the remaining courses. The photographer packed up early rather than risk an invoice no one could settle. Guests began whispering, sensing the shift in mood long before anyone explained it. Ren, by every account I heard afterward, spent the final hour of her 30th birthday crying in a service hallway while my parents scrambled to explain a story that no longer made sense to the people hearing it. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something colder, more clarifying, the specific ache of understanding, all at once, that the family who raised me had run the numbers on my forgiveness before they'd ever run the numbers on the guest list. The next morning, the fraud investigator called with an update. 2 of the vendors had security footage from their intake counters, time-stamped over the previous weeks. She asked if I wanted to see it. I said yes, though part of me already dreaded what I'd find. The footage showed my mother at the floral wholesaler, reading numbers off a slip of paper while placing the order. It showed my father at the rental company, signing a contract for lighting and a photo backdrop, listing me as the billing contact without a flicker of hesitation. Neither of them had hidden their faces from a single camera because neither of them had ever imagined I would see it or that it would matter if I did. There was one more detail the investigator mentioned, almost offhand, that reframed the entire story for me. The earliest charge, made nearly 6 weeks before the party, lined up exactly with a family dinner I remembered clearly, the same dinner where I'd left my phone on the counter for. I sat with that news longer than I sat with almost anything else in this entire ordeal. It's one thing to feel taken advantage of once. It's another to realize the exploitation had a second phase already scheduled, waiting quietly behind the first. Not everyone in the family took the news the same way, and watching those reactions split down the middle taught me almost as much as the theft itself had. My Uncle Desmond, my father's older brother, called to tell me I was overreacting, that families handle things internally, and that involving a formal fraud case was a betrayal in its own right, one he seemed to consider worse than the original deception. I told him, calmly, that I hadn't involved anyone. The bank's own fraud system had flagged the charges automatically, hours before I even knew what was happening. He didn't have a response to that, only a long pause before he changed the subject to ask how work was going, as if the conversation before it had simply evaporated. Word moved quickly after that. Ren's boyfriend, Theo, had been at the party and overheard enough of the chaos to start asking his own questions the next day. When Ren finally admitted, reluctantly, that the money had come from my card without my knowledge, Theo went quiet in a way she clearly hadn't expected. He called me himself 2 days later. Not to take sides, he said, but because he needed to understand what had actually happened, since every version he'd heard so far contradicted the last one. I told him plainly. He was silent for a long moment before saying he felt sick imagining how close he'd come to marrying into a family that treated deception as a logistics problem rather than a moral one. He wasn't the only person recalculating. Within the week, my Aunt Ruth called, something she hadn't done in over a year. She said she'd heard 3 different versions of the story from 3 different relatives and wanted to hear it from me directly. I told her plainly, without exaggeration, the folder, the handwriting, the frozen card, the footage. She went quiet, then said something I hadn't expected. I always wondered why you were the one who paid for everything and the one who got told about nothing, she said. I should have said something years ago. That sentence didn't undo anything, but it confirmed what I'd spent years talking myself out of, that the imbalance in my family hadn't been my imagination. Other people had seen it too. They had simply never said it out loud because saying it meant someone would eventually have to do something about it. Ruth wasn't finished either. Before we hung up, she told me about a conversation she'd overheard years earlier, back when Ren and I were still teenagers, between my mother and grandmother. My mother had said, almost proudly, that she never worried about me the way she worried about Ren, because I always figured things out on my own. At the time, Ruth said, it had sounded like a compliment. Hearing it again now, with everything else laid out in front of her, she said it sounded like something else entirely, permission, quietly given, to stop paying attention to one daughter because the other one required more visible effort to manage. Once I let myself stop excusing it, memories I'd buried for years started resurfacing on their own. The birthday when my achievement award sat unopened on the counter for a week while Ren's mediocre report card got framed. The holiday when I was handed the grocery list, and the cooking while everyone else watched television. The countless small moments where I was praised for being so mature in the exact same breath that excused someone else from having to grow up at all. None of it had felt like mistreatment in the moment. All of it, looked at together, told a story I'd refused to read for most of my life. My parents called 2 more times that week, and each call followed the same rhythm. First, minimizing, it wasn't as much money as it sounded. They'd have paid it back eventually, somehow, someday. Then guilt, I was the one with a stable income. Surely I could understand why they'd made the choice they did. Never once, in either call, did the word sorry appear without a condition wrapped around it. Never once did either of them ask what it had felt like to learn about my own exclusion through a stack of vendor invoices instead of a conversation. I stopped answering by the end of that week. Not out of anger, though the anger was real and earned. I stopped because I finally understood that continuing to engage meant continuing to audition for a role I'd already been quietly cast out of. The family's emergency fund, available on demand, invited only when convenient. There was a strange, quiet week in the middle of all this when nothing happened at all. No calls, no updates from the investigator, no messages from anyone in my family. I remember that week more vividly than some of the louder ones, because it was the first time in months I let myself simply exist without bracing for the next phone call. I went to a Saturday farmer's market alone, bought flowers for my own apartment for the first time in my adult life, and cried a little in my car afterward. Not from sadness exactly, but from the strange unfamiliarity of doing something small and kind for myself, without first checking whether anyone else needed the money instead. The fraud case moved forward over the following months. Both vendors, once shown the paperwork, cooperated fully with the investigation, handing over signed contracts and time-stamped records. The bank's internal review confirmed none of the charges carried my authorization, and my card was reissued with full protections. Restitution was eventually ordered, structured as a repayment plan tied directly to the unauthorized total. It wasn't dramatic. It was paperwork, quiet and procedural, closing a door that had been left open far too long. I want to tell you the rest of this story is about revenge. It isn't. It's about what I built once I stopped waiting for permission to matter. I used part of the restitution, once it began coming through, as a down payment on a small condo near the waterfront. The first home that was entirely mine, bought without covering anyone else's expenses first. I remember standing in the empty living room the day I got the keys, sunlight pouring through bare windows, and feeling something unclench in my chest that I hadn't realized had been tight for years. At work, my logistics team was restructured that same spring, and I was offered a regional coordinator role, more responsibility, but also, for the first time, genuine recognition rather than quiet reliance. My manager told me directly that I was trusted precisely because I handled pressure without needing to be chased for results. It was such a small thing to hear out loud. It shouldn't have meant as much as it did. The role came with a small team of my own, and I made a quiet promise to myself early on that I would never let anyone on that team feel the way I'd felt for most of my life. Useful only in proportion to what they could quietly absorb without complaint. When one of my new hires apologized for asking a clarifying question during her first week, I told her plainly that asking questions was not a burden, and that she'd never need to earn the right to take up space on my team. She looked at me strangely when I said it, like the sentence itself was unfamiliar to her, and I understood that look completely because I remembered exactly what it felt like to hear something like that for the first time. I also started volunteering with a local nonprofit that helped young adults build financial independence, budgeting workshops, fraud awareness sessions, the kind of practical guidance I wish someone had given me before I spent a decade believing generosity had to be unconditional to count as real. The first workshop I led was on recognizing early signs of financial exploitation within families, a topic I chose deliberately and one I nearly backed out of teaching the morning of, worried it would feel too close to my own story to get through without my voice cracking. It didn't crack. Instead, halfway through the session, a young woman in the back raised her hand and said quietly that she'd been covering her older brother's rent for 2 years without either of her parents ever acknowledging it out loud, and she'd never had the words to describe what that felt like until that exact moment. I realized then that the workshop wasn't just something I was giving to other people. It was something I needed to hear out loud myself, from someone else's mouth, to finally believe it wasn't just my own bitterness talking. It was through one of those sessions that I met Callum, a physical therapist who'd come in to help the nonprofit set up its client intake system. We ended up talking long after the session ended, and what struck me most in the weeks that followed was how little he asked of me. He never once treated my job title like a resource to be managed. He asked what tired me out, what made me laugh, what I actually wanted on a random Tuesday, and then he waited for the answers instead of already planning what to do with them. Callum and I had been seeing each other for about 4 months by then, and one evening, over dinner at his apartment, I told him the whole story from the beginning. The folder, the handwriting, the frozen card, the vacation deposit I'd only just learned about. He listened without interrupting, which I'd come to realize was rarer than it should be. When I finished, he asked only one question. He wanted to know what I needed from him, not what he thought I should do about my family. I hadn't realized, until that dinner, how much of my life I'd spent around people who answered questions I hadn't asked, and how unfamiliar it felt to finally be asked one instead. Months passed without contact from my parents or Ren. The silence at first felt strange, like a held breath I didn't know how to release. Slowly, it became something closer to peace. Then, on a Sunday afternoon in early autumn, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find all 3 of them standing on my porch, my mother, my father, and Ren, none of them quite meeting my eyes. I let them in, mostly because I didn't want the conversation happening in front of my neighbors. They sat stiffly on my new furniture, glancing around a home none of them had known existed until that moment. My mother spoke first, her voice smaller than I remembered it. She said the repayment plan had strained them badly, that Ren's relationship with Theo had grown distant since the party, that things had been hard for everyone. My father asked, quietly, if I would consider telling the investigators it had all been a misunderstanding, now that enough time had passed. Ren said we were still family, and family was supposed to forgive. I asked them the same question I'd asked my father the night of the party, except this time I wanted a real answer. When they were planning the party, at any point had they considered inviting me? The silence lasted long enough to answer for them. My father broke it first, saying quietly that they hadn't wanted things to feel complicated that night. I asked him what exactly he thought would have been complicated about having his older daughter at his younger daughter's birthday. He didn't have an answer for that either, only a vague reference to old tension that no one in that room had ever once tried to name directly to my face. My mother reached for my hand, and I let her take it, though I didn't return the grip. She said she never meant for me to find out the way I did, as though the method of discovery, rather than the decision itself, was the part she regretted. I told them, calmly, that I finally understood what I hadn't let myself see for years, that love in that house had always come with conditions, and mine had simply been the condition of usefulness. I told them forgiveness might come someday for my own peace, but it would never rewrite what had already happened, and it would never mean pretending the harm hadn't been real. My mother started to say they'd made mistakes. I told her, gently, that I wasn't interested in that word anymore. A mistake is forgetting a birthday. What happened to me had been planned for weeks, written down in someone's own handwriting, with my name attached to a joke about how little I'd notice. Ren spoke last, before they stood to leave. She said she used to envy how much easier I made everything look, how effortlessly I seemed to handle responsibility, and that some part of her had assumed I simply didn't need the same things she did: attention, invitations, a seat saved at the table. I told her that wasn't envy she'd been feeling. It was convenience. It's easy to believe someone doesn't need something when believing otherwise would require you to give it to them. They left without much more to say. I didn't feel hatred watching them go. I felt something quieter, a door closing softly instead of slamming, which somehow made it more final. Here's the part of this story I didn't expect, the part that still catches me off guard some evenings when I think back on it. A few weeks after that visit, Ren sent me a message, not quite an apology, but close to one, admitting she'd known about the card before the party, and had chosen silence because speaking up would have meant losing the celebration she wanted. It wasn't everything, but it was the first time anyone in that house had told me the truth without first calculating what it would cost them to say it. I don't know if that relationship will ever fully rebuild. I've stopped needing it to, in order to feel whole. A year after the party, almost to the week, Callum and I moved a few of his things into the waterfront condo, not as a grand gesture, just a slow, ordinary accumulation of toothbrushes and books, and a second set of keys cut, without ceremony. I remember standing in the kitchen one evening, watching him make coffee in a mug I'd bought for myself the week I closed on the condo, and feeling a kind of calm I genuinely hadn't believed I was allowed to have. Nobody in that kitchen was keeping score. Nobody was waiting to see what I could be used for next. It was, in the quietest possible way, everything the last several years of my life had not been. What I know now is this: the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally will sometimes show you, in the smallest and cruelest ways, exactly where you rank in their private calculations. A birthday you weren't invited to. A card number copied in an unguarded moment. For words written in someone else's handwriting, meant for no one else's eyes. I used to think the worst part of that story was the money. It wasn't. The worst part was realizing how long I'd mistaken being useful for being loved, and how much lighter I felt the moment I finally learned to tell the difference apart. Some nights, I still think about that folder sitting open on my mother's kitchen table and the 4 words written beside my name. I used to read them as cruelty. Now I read them as an accident of honesty, a rare moment where someone in that house wrote down exactly what they believed about me, instead of dressing it up in the language of family and love. In a strange way, I'm grateful for that honesty, even if it wasn't meant for my eyes. It gave me something most people never get: proof, in someone else's own handwriting, that it was never me who was wrong to expect more. If you've ever had to learn that same lesson in your own way, on your own timeline, I hope you know this: being needed and being wanted are not the same thing. And walking away from people who only ever offer you the first one isn't bitterness. It's the beginning of finally being able to breathe.